We are recording this if you weren't here to hear about that, but I do want to thank everyone who has joined us tonight. It's a bit of a scary time right now in our country. I liken it to the biggest game of whack-a-mole any of us have ever played, probably in a long time. So, my name is Laura Welch. I'm president of Illinois Now. I'm out in the Naperville area. And I'm thrilled to see so many people that are with different organizations that I know and have worked with, as well as some new faces. So I want to welcome you. Um, Tonight we are going to talk about the SAVE Act, which means the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. I'm not going to give you a lot of facts because our two speakers tonight, Kathy Cortez from the League of Women Voters of Illinois and Eli Brottman from Change Illinois Action Fund, are the ones that have the information. So I'd rather we get it from people who have testified in front of our legislators who have the information. And what I want you to feel free to do is raise your hand if you have questions, or if you're not comfortable being on camera, which is totally fine, put a question in the chat and we'll monitor that. And, both Kathy and Eli are welcoming of a relatively open conversation. We have some questions, but I have a feeling they're going to answer them before we get there, or you may actually have those questions as well. So let's make this a conversation, and feel free. Let's just raise our hands and chat away. So just 1 second here. Bear with me. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our two speakers tonight, and then I am going to let them start talking. First, we have Kathy Cortez. She is the vice president with the aide vice president with the League of Women Voters of Illinois, where she chairs the League's Issues and Advocacy Committee, focusing on education, policy, and lobbying related to democracy and equity issues facing Illinois. Prior to accepting the role of chairperson, Kathy served as the committee's issue specialist for fair and affordable housing. More recently, Kathy has worked with the U.S. League to promote democracy-related advocacy at the federal level, including implementing phone call Fridays to U.S. representatives and authoring op-eds for the League on immigration, vote by mail, and the SAVE Act. Welcome, Kathy. Thank you very much. And then we have Eli Brottman. He is the policy director at Change Illinois. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics with minors in statistics, stats, and computer science. And he is excited to utilize his quantitative background to develop strong policy. Having consulted on dozens of political campaigns, Eli has seen equity issues within politics and government firsthand. He is committed to using these experiences to advocate for change in his lifelong home state of Illinois. Welcome, Eli. Thank you very much. So, Kathy, we're going to let you start off and teach us about what the SAVE Act is and the dangers it poses.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation tonight to talk to this great group about such an important issue facing not just the people of Illinois, but all of us around the United States. I think many of you are probably familiar with the League of Women Voters. For those of you that are not, as our name implies, we believe that every citizen should be protected in their right to vote, and that electoral system should encourage participation of all eligible voters. The SAVE Act has been positioned by supporters as good for America. And that's because it presumes that non-citizen voting is a large problem that demands to be solved. It ensures that non-citizens will be unable to influence our elections by illegally voting in them. And it's responsive, they're arguing that it's responsive to an overwhelming mandate on the part of voters to keep non-citizens off of the voting rolls. And to be clear, it is not a position of the League that non-citizens under our current laws should be able to vote in elections, right? So the SAVE Act is a good thing? I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about it and leave that for you to sort of decide for yourself. Um, First, I'm going to talk about some rather mundane details about how the act might affect elections in Illinois. So really more from an administrative perspective. You're probably aware that it really affects only federal voting registration. We could, in fact, I guess in Illinois, theoretically decide only to implement this voter registration legislation for federal elections because we wouldn't need to comply with it for state and local elections. But in theory, that would also create a pretty messy election process and some chaos at the polls for, having different rules, different ballots, and things like that. So it does create some issues for states that may want to encourage additional participation that's outside of the realm of what would be allowed under this law at the federal level. Additionally, the SAVE Act only allows two methods of voter registration, which in my opinion is really only one method of voter registration, and you'll see why when I read what the two are. You can register in person, or you can register by using the National Mail Voter Registration Form and then show up in person to show all of your documentation. And the key here is that there is a lot of documentation that may be required for a citizen to be able to vote. And we'll talk a little bit about what those things look like. And I know that Eli's going to cover a fair amount of this when he talks as well. But the idea here is that everything must be done and presented in person and in original form. And that's a key element of what the SAVE Act demands at the federal level. So what does this mean for our state election authority? So for those of you that are interested in this kind of thing, it would likely cause the state to have to revert back to obsolete manual processes. So right now we have the ability to do online registration, for example, right? And you still have to present some documents if you're a first-time, if you're first-time registrant when you show up at the polls. But at least you can register online and indicate where you live and those sorts of things. It will also likely require the state to increase staffing significantly. I think we all saw what happened with the Real ID in the last couple of weeks when it came up to what people perceive to be a deadline, right? Not that everybody was jumping on a flight the next day, but people perceive there to be this deadline. And that's what happens every year for registration. A lot of people wait until the last minute because they know they've got that time. And so making sure that we don't have people standing outside of buildings and then the doors get locked and anybody left standing still can't register to vote for the day. We really don't want those kinds of things to happen. And so we likely would have to increase staffing at the state level. And also because, not naming any names, but organizations like the League of Women Voters and many others, democracy organizations, have always done that service for free. And this would require some officials at the election offices to do that work instead. So the bottom line is it does create some unfounded mandates for the state, and those would be the sorts of things that the state would need to wrestle with. And we all understand where we are with the budget right now. So adding this additional piece to it would not be great. And finally, those of you who have worked the polls, and I'm guessing at least a handful of you have, understand how difficult it is to get people to participate in running elections and trying to find people to work in this space. The SAVE Act actually creates criminal penalties that could be imposed on workers, even for administrative errors in registering a non-citizen to vote by mistake. And with that threat of those those criminal charges hanging over them, it will discourage people from wanting to sign up and do voter registration. So certainly less than ideal. But from what I've just described, doesn't seem catastrophic, right? So why has this bill created so much commotion? It's created the commotion because it imposes an equitable and economic and administrative requirements that create unnecessary barriers for people to register to vote. So let's talk about that a little bit. And again, I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail here because I suspect that Eli's got some of this covered. But let's at least talk about what the act requires. Again, we talked about in-person presentation of proof of citizenship at an election office. It presumes, contrary to any evidence to the contrary, that voters either have a passport or they have their original birth certificates, and oftentimes marriage certificates, divorce papers, and other things that you might need in order to register to vote now. And it presumes that if you don't have them, you can afford to get them. It eliminates common sense laws, as we've already talked about, that leverage advancements in technology, right? So secure online registration, automatic registration at the DMV, and things of that nature. And just, we did talk about this a couple minutes ago, but the Real ID does not include proof of citizenship. It cannot be used as identification for voter registration. So who are the folks that are going to be affected most by this? You can probably think about some of these for, on your own. But this is not a small subset of individuals that are impacted, right? We're talking about individuals who maybe don't have good access to transportation. There are lots of folks that are in the city that don't. There are lots of rural people that live great distances from their election offices. And, there are elderly people who just don't drive anymore and maybe don't have family around to get them to where they need to be to do that. There are homeless individuals, college students. I don't know about you guys, but I didn't send my kids off to school with their original birth certificates or originals of just about anything they might need for that matter. Individuals who've experienced evictions or catastrophes where they've lost all their records. And there are some military and Native American IDs that don't meet the requirements of the bill. So we've got an issue with that as well. The bill does make some accommodation for disabled people, but it says the states need to accommodate, but it doesn't say how, and it doesn't indicate what might be acceptable. So that could be a potential issue. Now, within each of those groups, there are two other big pockets. There are the low and modest income individuals who can neither afford to procure documentation. I mean, if you're struggling to put food on your table, the extra cost for a family or a couple, right? Two adults, there could be three adults in a family who are eligible to vote, to actually have to spend somewhere between $60 and maybe $160, depending on what their circumstances are and the information that they need, is a non-starter. If you can't afford food, putting out an extra 40, 50 bucks at one time to get registered is going to be a hindrance. And with this group, I would be completely out of line, not to mention that it places a bigger burden on women than it does on men to be able to register to vote, mostly because 80% of us, when we married, changed our last names, and our birth records don't match our current identification. And so again, I won't go into too many details there, but I think you can imagine that even within those groups, so you've got this wide group of people, especially particularly women who are roughly half the population, right, who are going to be negatively affected by this in some way, shape, or form. So why all the commotion? Because just as it's not okay for non-citizens to vote, it's not okay to impair the ability of citizens to vote. And that's the big distinction that we're making here. It doesn't, this bill does not prioritize preserving voting rights. It prioritizes keeping non-citizens off the voting roster. And when you think about the huge numbers of people that are eligible voting citizens relative to the number of non-citizens who are voting, it's a huge overreach, it's overkill, and it clearly is going to discourage participation. Now, I'm not going to get too far into this, but I will leave you with a thought before I turn this over to Eli. And that is that there are lots of people who have petitioned their legislators to do this work, right? To fix this problem. But I don't think that those people understood that they were going to be one of the people in those 7 or 8 categories that we talked about, right? They don't know the person getting screwed is them because they don't understand what's in this law. And so those are the sorts of things that I think as we get out and talk to each other, that we want to get more into the weeds on and help people understand what their own personal situations look like, or the personal situations of other people that they love and who are citizens who want to vote. So with that, if there aren't any specific questions, I will turn it over to Eli, and then hopefully we can, after he's done talking, we can wrap this around with some things that you might be able to do to help have an impact on making sure this doesn't see the light of day in the Senate.
And Illinois Now for the invitation. I'm so happy to be here and to engage in this important conversation tonight. As we said earlier, my name is Eli Brottman, and I'm the Policy Director for the Change Illinois Action Fund. We are a nonpartisan organization, and we champion equitable democracy and ethics in government. This includes advocating for fair math, voting rights, improved voting access, and working to end prison gerrymandering. All of our work is done through an equity lens. I want to start by talking a bit about the SAVE Act and what it does. And then I will explain more of the harms it causes and how we can fight back against this dangerous legislation. We've all been hearing about the SAVE Act and the harms it will cause. Kathy talked about it a bit, and I'm going to continue where she left off and dive deeper tonight. But first, I would be remiss if we didn't take a look at what some of the proponents of this legislation are saying. As we've been discussing, they think it will help prevent non-citizens from voting. They're typically making claims that there is widespread voter fraud by non-citizens that's taking place based on non-citizens voting, and that we therefore need to crack down on it. I will share evidence proving that is not the case later on this evening, but in the meantime, I want to talk about how this legislation would work a little bit. As Kathy talked about, there would be very cumbersome ID requirements showing proof of citizenship in person. This would have to take the form of a passport or a birth certificate, because in all but 5 states, a real ID does not show citizenship. In those states, which are Michigan, Minnesota, New York, Vermont, and Washington, there are special citizen-only real IDs. So that's very limited and limited to a select few states. For a birth certificate to be valid under the Act, the name on it must exactly match the name on one's voter registration. We're very lucky to live here in Illinois, where the vast majority of our members of Congress staunchly oppose this dangerous legislation. Many people certainly do not have that privilege, and many are also not aware of the dangers of the legislation. These type of ID requirements are a classic voter suppression tactic, and they need to be called out as such. It will be very difficult to provide this ID in person for many who are caregivers for children and other family members, or those who work hourly jobs, as well as voters who live in rural areas and Native American voters who live far from their local election authorities' offices. Additionally, requiring proof of citizenship in person would undermine many key voting access laws in our state, such as automatic voting registration and online or mail-in voter registration. As was mentioned earlier, mail-in voting registration could only take place if you also brought documents in person, which kind of defeats the purpose. Let's talk a little more about who this will disenfranchise, because it's a lot of people. The Brennan Center for Justice, a nonpartisan policy and law think tank, analyzed this legislation and concluded that it will disenfranchise more than 21 million Americans. That's over 10% of voters. This will include potentially disenfranchising millions of voters right here in Illinois, all while addressing a false notion of voter fraud. The impact of this legislation will present a problem for the 84% of married women who changed their surnames, transgender individuals, and many others. Furthermore, the alternative of having a passport does not solve the problem. It actually furthers the disparities in voting access. About half of Americans do not possess a passport. Along with these already cumbersome impacts of the legislation, The SAVE Act will also lead to unnecessary purchase of voters from voter rolls, which will further marginalize voters of color. And these new processes for proving citizenship will put considerable strain on election authorities, as Kathy also mentioned earlier. It will require additional personnel, additional resources, and this will come at a major cost to the voters, as well as slow the process, and therefore lessen participation because it will be inconvenient to vote. It also, as Kathy mentioned, puts undue stress and strain on election workers who will be worried about criminal penalties for mere clerical errors. Adding these criminal penalties to eliminate clerical errors does not keep our elections more secure, and it does not help communities in any way. And as we'll talk about later, the number of non-citizens actually voting could just as easily end up voting through clerical errors made with the SAVE Act in place because it's that small. It is absolutely imperative that elected officials and voters alike understand the true impacts of the SAVE Act. We need to spread awareness to friends and neighbors, especially those whose elected officials may support the legislation, but also to everyone to ensure that they know that they will be held accountable and that there is broad opposition. The SAVE Act is mostly supported by Republicans as well as some moderate Democrats in the U.S. House. We need to make clear to proponents of the legislation and those who may be undecided the widespread harm it causes, not just to voters who lean liberal or Democratic, but to all voters. Arguably, the harms are actually greatest to conservative and Republican voters. Women who change their surname tend to skew older and more conservative than the general population. Those who hold passports and hence may have an easier time voting under the SAVE Act tend to be disproportionately under the age of 30, wealthy, college-educated, and liberal. Hence, those who will go through extra steps to vote tend to lean more conservative, most likely. Furthermore, we need to debunk myths about voter fraud. As the nonpartisan Brennan Center pointed out, it's a federal crime to even register as a non-citizen, and very few people have done it. Those who have mostly has been by accident. Penalties could include 5 years in prison as well as deportation. No one is going to risk everything they have in order to try to register to vote. Brennan Center analyzed 23.5 million votes cast in 42 jurisdictions in the 2016 election, and they found just 30 instances of non-citizens voting. 30. Furthermore, to make the case even more compelling, the Bipartisan Policy Center analyzed the Heritage Foundation's election fraud cases database and found 77 instances of non-citizens voting between 1999 and 2023. Now I'll say that again, 77 total instances between 1999 and 2023, a 24-year period. That's an average of just over 3 instances per year, with no more than 10 instances total in all 24 years in the state of Illinois. The evidence is abundantly clear and consistent, including from far-right organizations like the Heritage Foundation. There is no widespread voter fraud being committed by non-citizens. The notion that it's taking place is designed to incite fear and undermine the integrity of our elections through voter suppression. Now, it's important that we talk about how to get this information across to elected officials, because there's a lot of people who are being exposed to a lot of propaganda, whether it's from elected officials or from others, about voter fraud, about other issues, and truly believe it. And a lot of elected officials are furthering the misinformation because they feel it helps them politically. When Kathy, myself, and many other representatives from pro-democracy and good government organizations testified in Springfield, we faced questioning from the opposition in the minority party, implying, in a sense, that we were okay with non-citizens voting or wanting non-citizens to vote as long as it wasn't more than a certain number of them. I want to reiterate again, like what Kathy said, it is not a policy stance of the Change Illinois Action Fund that we are encouraging non-citizens to vote. But a few non-citizens voting, maybe a few a year across the country, compared to millions of voters being disenfranchised and unable to vote, disproportionately including women, people of color, and members of the LGBTQ+ community. It makes very clear what appropriate policy is. And it is not passing the SAVE Act, because all it does is disenfranchise voters. Those handful of non-citizens are not changing the results of elections. But if we disenfranchise millions of voters, especially millions of women, that will disenfranchise voters. And that does undermine the fairness and the integrity of our election. So I want to conclude by talking a little bit about how to get this information out to elected officials. Oftentimes, there's a lot of bureaucracy with these offices that can be overwhelming to figure out, how do I get a hold of my elected official and what do I need to tell them? Obviously, elected officials love hearing from their constituents because you have 2 votes for them at the end of the day. So the first step is educate everybody you know about this. We have, summer, lots of barbecues coming up, Memorial Day. Talk to people, encourage them to do their research and to reach out to their elected officials if they have a concern. We need to focus on those who likely do support the SAVE Act, but ultimately we need to reach out to everyone, like I said, to make sure they're being held accountable and to make sure that they are aware of their constituents' concerns. Furthermore, anybody should be encouraged to reach out to elected officials and share concerns and share that their votes would be suppressed. And, for those who are members of the Republican Party in particular, who are concerned about the implementation of this and their Republican elected officials supporting it, it should be made clear to those Republican elected officials that Republicans are opposing it too, because way too often legislators are reducing this to a partisan matter, and it really is a lot more complicated than that. And arguably, like we talked about, disenfranchises Republicans the most. So legislators need to hear very clearly that this will hurt their constituents. This may even hurt them. And that's something that just is not cutting through the propaganda enough. And until we do that, this problem will continue. As has been mentioned many times tonight, the key goal right now is to make sure this doesn't pass the Senate. The Senate has the filibuster in place, meaning it needs 60 votes unless cloture is invoked, which would require a different 60 vote minimum vote being taken to invoke cloture, meaning it would only take 50 votes plus the vice president breaking the tie in order to pass this legislation. The good news is most Democrat elected officials right now are staunchly opposed to this, and there is a strong chance that because of that, it never gets to the 60 votes. But we need to make sure that they're aware of constituents' concerns, because it's not always a partisan matter, and there have been votes where things backed by the administration have passed with 60 votes because some members have, joined with the other party. These, a lot of the federal votes in particular are not purely partisan, that even more so than on the state level. And it's important that people understand the concerns from their constituencies on how this disenfranchises women, how this disenfranchises people of color, and how this disenfranchises a diverse group of voters. Because they will also, people on all sides of the aisle will be hearing a lot of proponents of the SAVE Act talking about immigration concerns and voter fraud that we now know does not exist. So I would urge everyone to call your U.S. senators, encourage people you know in other states to call their U.S. senators and share why they're opposed to the SAVE Act. Furthermore, you can always call U.S. senators in other states. It's not as powerful as when you are calling as a constituent, but it still makes a difference when phone lines are flooded with phone calls talking about the harm of this legislation, and may make people think twice when they're contemplating supporting it, but also are getting these calls and concerns about the impact it will have on their reelection or their constituents or anything else. You know, I'd like to think they will do it because it's the right thing to do, but oftentimes people are very worried about their reelections, and we have to factor that into how we talk about the legislation. So, in summary, the SAVE Act is a gross overreach of power. It sets us back several decades, and I hope all elected officials on all levels of government in Illinois and beyond act swiftly to warn members of Congress and U.S. senators about the harm this will inflict on voters across Illinois and across the country. We will continue doing our part to educate people on the dangers of this legislation, and I encourage you to take action. I look forward to any further questions you have on that tonight, and thank you all for your time. I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you so much, Kathy and Eli. I really appreciate the information. It feels overwhelming, but I think everything in general these days feels overwhelming. So I want to open up the floor, and if you have questions, please raise your hand. Or again, you know, if you're not comfortable, you're welcome to put your questions in the chat. One of the questions that I have, you know, someone can go the day that they're voting and register. Is that no longer going to be possible? I mean, are they still going to be able to? I mean, I know they can still do it for state and local, but what about for the federal elections?
It's still allowed, but you would have to bring with you all of the documentation that you would have to bring to register to vote at an election office, right? And this is where being a poll worker becomes particularly dangerous, right? Because the poll workers are trained to operate the polls as a poll worker. I work with folks that don't really understand even our very simple voter registration rules today, right? And so if you inadvertently allow someone to vote because you missed something in their documentation, you know, these are where the problems come in. You're going to face angry voters, all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, you can still do it, but the documentation requirements are the same. And Laura, if you don't mind my expanding on this for just a second, but I'm going to tell you a personal story. Because this is the kind of stuff that I think people don't fully appreciate. I know I didn't, right? So when I went to get my real ID, I had a birth certificate and a marriage certificate. I waited a little bit, so I kind of knew that I had to produce these documents. So I took them in, and I didn't have any problems, right? But I have a sister who lives in Tennessee, and she went in and she realized that, yes, she was going to have to bring in her marriage certificate along with her birth certificate, which she did. And they said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we can't accept this," right? And she said, "Well, you know, this is my marriage certificate, my birth certificate. This is what you said you needed." They said, "Oh no, because she was previously married, but did not change her name back to her maiden name when she divorced. So the marriage certificate had the name, he had some, like, she had 3 different names, right? The marriage certificate, the guy that married her married Linda, you know, X, not Linda Y, which is what the birth certificate said. So she had to go all the way back through and get marriage certificates, divorce papers, all kinds of stuff, and bring it back in. People aren't going to have that second chance when they're registering right up against that, you know, as we talked about before, right? You're coming in, you're trying to register 3-4 days before the election cutoff is, and you're not going to have that chance. You're not going to take another day off of work to be during business hours doing this kind of stuff. And so it's those everyday stories that I think potentially, even when someone like me doesn't really appreciate it until someone in my own family has it happen to them, right? I think that our legislators and our Congress people need to understand that this is real life stuff. That I just moved my mom into assisted living, so I'm going to have to re-register her. But she can't drive, she's in assisted living. And now I don't live in the same town as her anymore. I may live across the country from her. Who's going to protect her right to vote? Because that's what I want to know. I don't want to know who the one person is who's not going to, who's going to vote, who shouldn't be. I want to know who's protecting my mom's right to vote. She's voted since she was 18. She's 85. And now you're saying she can't do that anymore? I need an explanation as to why you think that's okay. Now, I don't know if we have some lawyers in the room. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm totally going to butcher this saying, but I know that those of you who will know it, it's something along the lines of better to let, 100, guilty people go free than to convict one innocent man, right? And so I think to me, this is a very similar theme, right? It's better to let the 70 people that aren't supposed to vote than to take away a citizen's right to vote. And I think that that's the strong message we need to start bringing back to our senators is that we get it. We don't like people who aren't supposed to vote voting either. But we're not willing to give up a critical constitutional right, which is what this law does to make that happen. You need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. You need to figure out how to do both. And I think that's a story that we need to bring with us, along with these examples of real life situations that are having an impact.
Right. I see Maria has a question. I'm registered. Oh, well, let's go back. There was a question and Eli did answer it in the chat. Has this passed the House yet? Yes, it did. Including with what, 4 Democrats? Not from Illinois, because I'm sure we'd all be in the phones. But yeah, 4 Democrats and I guess more purple areas of the country did vote in favor of this. So then Maria has a question. I'm registered and I voted. Do we have to re-register? Eli, can you answer that?
So,
please.
Absolutely. So generically, no, you don't have to re-register. Like, not everyone has to re-register just because of that. However, if you move, you have to re-register. So as soon as you move, and moving more frequently disproportionately impacts disabled people, elderly people, lower income people, younger people, etc., you have to re-register. And if you're, like Kathy talked about, if you're an elderly person who's moving into assisted living, who married several decades ago and changed your name and always voted for decades in your married name and don't have like the documentation and don't have a passport, there's a major problem. And that's, a lot of people. So, yeah, it's not an automatic re-registration, but over the course of a lifetime, probably most registered voters will have to re-register at some point. So the impact will be broad and it will be serious.
Thank you. I see Gail, well, Susan first, I can't get up there. Susan says there are 4 Dems who need a primary challenge, midterms, and then Gail has told us who they are. And you can see that in the chat. Jared Golden of Maine, Marie, I've got stuff in the way. Marie Glusenkamp Perez from Washington, Henry Cuellar from Texas, and Ed Case from Hawaii. If you know anybody in those states, make sure that they make some phone calls. I also have a question, and I think Susan and I were talking about this the other day. Where is the bill? The bill first needs to be assigned to a committee, and as of the last time I checked, it hadn't been assigned to a committee. Do you have either one of you having an update on that and kind of what the process would be?
I don't
No.
have any update. I think what you just described is what all of us know to be the case right now. And I'm not sure if other things, such as the big beautiful bill and things like that, will be taking priority over something like this in the next couple of weeks. Eli, I don't know if you've got your ear to the ground a little bit better. I don't follow the federal stuff as much as I do state, but I think it's in waiting.
So I'm currently on the Congress website. I pulled up the SAVE Act, also known as House Resolution 22. It states that it passed the House on April 10th of this year and was received in the Senate, and that's the most recent action. So I'm not seeing anything about it being assigned to a committee at this time, but that doesn't mean it won't be, and there are lots of different ways that legislatures can skirt around posting deadlines and pass legislation quickly. So we really need to, make sure that we're checking this regularly and seeing what's happening, and most importantly, not slowing down on outreach just because we haven't seen anything, because the best way to prevent it from moving further and is to make sure it's known that this opposition is continuous, even when it's not in the press every single day, and that it is going to be consistent, and that voters are not going to let up about it. So they won't let up even more should it pass.
It is interesting. Tracy and I and another one of our members were at a tabling event at Benedictine University out here in Lisle. I was amazed at how many people have no clue about this bill. So even people that tend to vote the right way, meaning the left way, trying to keep this nonpartisan, I apologize. It's hard for me sometimes. Even they didn't know. People that watch the news, pay attention, are part of organizations like we are. So just even talking about it to everybody, that regardless of whether you think they have the information, let them know. And Susan has in the chat posted some information, some fact sheets and things that are really wonderful to help give people some real quick down and dirty information, and places that you can go for more details. So we have another question. Eileen, Rico, assuming an expired passport would make a voter ineligible. True?
Yeah,
Kathy, you're shaking your
an
head.
expired document is not going to be considered valid documentation.
Shannon, you have a question?
Yes, my parents were U.S. citizens, grandparents, great-grandparents, etc. But my birth certificate and my passport disagree as to where I was born.
Oh.
Because I was born in the Canal Zone, which no longer exists. My birth certificate lists my parents' citizenship at time of child's birth as U.S. My father was afraid I would have difficulty proving citizenship, so he took my birth certificate over and recorded my birth with the U.S. consulate in Panama. Originally, my passport said Canal Zone because it still existed. But when the land changes hands, Uncle Sam changes where you were born the next time you renew your passport. Now, I went with my passport when I went to get my real ID, but when I registered for Medicare and for Social Security, they wanted naturalization papers, and I had to go into the Social Security office to explain. Where is that going to leave me if I move?
Whoa, that's a tough one.
I wish I had a good answer for you, but I think what you're describing is the sort of unique circumstances that you're probably not the only person in the country with this sort of an issue, right? And so I
John
think it's a
McCain
really
would have
good
had the same
example.
problem
Yeah.
Mm.
if he were still around, because he was born in the Canal Zone.
Yeah, it's a great example, and I think it's those kind of stories that our Congress people need to understand and hear about.
Wow. Well, if you find out, Shannon, let us know, and we'll share that information with other people that might be in some sort of limbo like you. Jean?
Yes, I have another just interesting story. I found out after I divorced second husband that he was never legally adopted and that therefore his name was not legally the name that I was married under. Imagine the complications of that if I had to prove that the name that I had married under him was a legal name when I don't even know if this man is alive or exists in the world. I have no idea. Imagine that complication. And I dare say there's probably people that don't even realize that back in older times, it was not uncommon for people just to give a name to a child at the start of school and was never legally set as that name. So just another story to tell.
Oh my goodness gracious.
Unbelievable.
Wow.
Yeah, I actually talked to a couple of ladies who are a few years older than me, letting me know that their birth certificates, despite the fact that they were born in the United States, their birth certificates don't meet the requirements that are in the law. And I can't remember if it was something to the effect of both of the parents' names being on there or something like that. But there's there are very specific requirements within the bills to the kind of documentation, and it appears that their birth certificate would not meet it. So there are going to be all kinds of stories like this, and not having people be able to vote because of it is heartbreaking.
Yeah. Do you know, maybe Eli, this is a question for you. I mean, obviously we don't have any majorities, so do we know, I mean, we've had legislation that, has the Congress has tried passing in the passage on Lewis Voting Rights Act and others. Are you seeing anything kind of bubbling up at the federal level that might counteract any of this, that you think has any strength or anything?
To be honest, it's hard to tell without being on the ground in Washington, because a lot of that opposition or support for legislation, both at the state and federal level, happens on the ground in the Capitol. So I'm really more privy to what's happening in the state Capitol, where I spend a lot of time. But what I will say is, like, regardless of that opposition bubbling up, it's something that, will involve convincing people who currently are supporting it. So that opposition is going to need to be very grassroots and from across the country, which is hard to get on the ground in Washington just because of the time and costs involved with travel. So I don't know direct answer to your question, but I just try to use this to reiterate how important it is that there's grassroots outreach through phone calls to legislator offices during business hours, as well as voicemails after hours, if that's all one can do to reiterate the opposition to the SAVE Act.
Thank you. And then, I don't know why I can't go. Hold on just one second. Jean asked, do you have apologize for the dog? She is not happy because I shut the door. Let's see. Oh, you did just answer it. So Jean wanted to know about sorry. Do you have links to the studies that show there's no significant data on how many people have actually voted that were not citizens? Could you put it in the chat? And then Eli, I believe that's what you did. Is that correct? You put that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So for context, there is as I hinted out in my discussion tonight, there was a hearing in Springfield in which people had the opportunity to provide testimony in support or opposition to the SAVE Act, sharing concerns about the consequences. Kathy, myself, and several other pro-democracy and good government organizations testified, sharing our concerns about the SAVE Act, and that link I provided is to a post on our blog that details my testimony, much of which overlaps with what I shared tonight, and it contains footnotes with citations to this information about how many non-citizens have been voted, etc.
Great, thank you.
May I reply quickly to Beth?
Yes, please.
Beth, I'm not even going to try to say your last name because I know I'm going to butcher it. But parting words for me: don't get discouraged, get mad, get active. That's what's going to make the difference here. There's a lot going on, and it is easy to get discouraged and not know what to do. The worst thing we can do is nothing at all. Get out there and tomorrow morning pick the phone up and make a phone call. And if it takes every day making the same phone call to the same person, then that's what we need to do to get this to happen. Trust me, it's going to make you feel better.
Exactly. And I would, second everything Kathy said, and also just add, this administration wants you to feel discouraged. This administration wants people to be so overwhelmed by everything and discouraged that they give up. So the way we stand up to them is by showing them that they can't bully us into inaction. They can't stop us from standing up for our democracy and protecting our democracy. And that happens through, making that phone call, sending that text message to a friend, whatever it is. But, even if you're calling a, handful of legislators a couple times a week, you might spend, minutes to an hour per week and have a big impact, especially if lots of people do it. The grassroots really makes a big difference, and it really adds up.
We can certainly see that from all the protests that are going on. They do have an effect. So, yes, Lindsay, emotion to motion. Very true. We need to just keep plugging away. I have socks that show Sisyphus pushing the rock up. I think actually Kelly Cassidy has those too, which I thought was kind of cool. But I will also tell you that we are currently planning our state conference for the fall. And it will be in Naperville at North Central College. September 27th is our projected date. And one of the main things that we will be focusing on is the 2026 elections, because like you, I'm sure if you are a spokesperson for an organization or just people know that you're part of an organization, I'm always getting questions. What can we do? What can we do? We need to get out there, get out the vote. And work with those that, like Eli was talking about, will protect our democracy and see what we can do to get them elected. So I'm going to put in, let's see if I can do this. ilnow.org is our website. Susan Bramlett-Lavin, our executive director, is wonderful, and Tracy is wonderful, putting information on our website for you to learn more about things like the SAVE Act, and how different legislation is affecting your lives and the lives of people that you love. So just, you're here for a reason. You're here because you do the work, or that you want the information. And so, as Kathy and Eli have said, please just share this with everyone that you possibly can. Don't assume people know what's going on, because when you assume like that, then we end up playing whack-a-mole every day, trying to suppress some of this really horrible stuff that's going on. But I want to end on a positive note. My heartfelt thanks to Kathy Cortez of League of Women Voters Illinois and Eli Brottman for Change Illinois Action Fund. You all have been wonderful. I hope your questions have been answered. If not, we can certainly share contact information, or I can, send your questions to us at Illinois Now, and we will make sure that we get the answers. As we always say, if we don't know the answer, we will find it for you. So I hope everybody learned something tonight And just keep doing what you're doing. You all are doing great. And always look on the bright side of life, as they say in in Monty Python. Sorry, I'm just kind of
One
a,
of my favorites.
I know.